Hello and a warm welcome to the debate on Press TV. I'm your host, Behruz Najjar. In what seems to be a decision under pressure from Washington, the UK has decided to ban Huawei from its phone networks by 2027. Chinese ambassador to the UK had warned last month that a ban on the Chinese telecom giant would tarnish the UK's reputation as independent from the US. This while President Trump has claimed credit for the move, saying that he personally convinced London to do so. Now, what's made London make such a decision? Security threat, as the White House labels it, trade ties, or dependence on the U.S.? How is this going to impact Sino-British ties? We'll watch a background report and then put this to debate.
The Chinese government says it's strongly opposed to what it calls the UK's groundless ban of Huawei's 5G kit. Beijing says London has lost its independence on the issue, calling on Britain to take responsible decisions regarding its long-term interests.
All this shows that the British government has indeed lost its precious independence and autonomy on the issue of Huawei. The gains of their decision do not make up for the losses.
China's Commerce Ministry has also slammed Britain's ban against Huawei as discriminatory, vowing to take necessary measures against the move. On Tuesday, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson ordered that Huawei equipment be removed from the country's 5G network by the end of 2027. Washington has also welcomed the UK's ban on Huawei. US President Donald Trump says he personally convinced Britain to ban the Chinese firm. On Wednesday, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced visa restrictions on Huawei employees and those of other Chinese firms, which he accused of involvement in human rights violations. Beijing has taken a jab at the US for its clampdown on Huawei.
I think what the US does has nothing to do with the word clean. What it does is genuine dirty tricks and dirty play.
Huawei has been under growing pressure from Washington in the shadow of a wider US-China multifaceted conflict, from trade to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea developments. The United States has been urging its allies to avoid the company's telecoms gear over security concerns. Washington accuses the Chinese tech giant of trying to steal trade secrets from American companies, but Huawei has repeatedly rejected the accusation. America's interventionism has grown more public in recent years significantly because U.S. policymakers no longer view the world as in a global ideological struggle in which every country, no matter how small, is a critical piece on a larger strategic chessboard. If a government publicly forces another country to change its decisions, then it's up to the people of that country to judge for themselves whether the intervening country has their best interests at heart.
All right, now time to invite our guests to discuss this issue tonight. Now, joining me will be investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Gloucester, and also a senior analyst with foreign policy in focus, Ian Williams, is joining us out of New York. Great to have you on the show, gentlemen. Let's go to Tony first. Is London's independence from Washington not questioned by making such a decision?
Well, of course it is. This is a US decision. It's not really a British decision. China says it's a groundless decision. I agree with them. They haven't shown any evidence that this Huawei equipment is any better or worse than American equipment or anyone else's equipment. A lot of this hardware that goes into the mobile networks and the data networks around Britain is actually not really that secure anyway. And certainly Huawei's is not more or less secure than anybody else's. The other thing about these contracts that are being severed now, as that's what's happening after this announcement, a lot of contracts to maintain, for example, Huawei equipment are being terminated, is that the equipment itself is not all this is about. There is an enormous multi-billion pound market in servicing equipment once it's been installed. You know, that is, for example, going around installing software updates on this equipment, etc., etc. That can't all be done remotely. Sometimes people have to actually turn the kit off, take it out, change something in a rack and put it back again. So these contracts are going on and on and on after the stuff's been installed. It's an enormous industry, so it's not just about the hardware. And Britain has totally and utterly caved in to US pressure. So the reason, I think, is most probably to do with the very important deal which Boris is trying to broker with Trump at the moment, post-Brexit. So they want a good trade deal with the United States, and it seems obvious to me that reading between the lines here, the Americans have said to the British, unless you get rid of Huawei, you're not going to get a decent trade deal off us. And the British have realised that they haven't got a lot of choice here. They're really just a kind of vassal state, like Britain was to the Roman Empire hundreds of years ago, to America now.
Now let's go to New York, to Ian. President Trump is boasting of being able to push Britain to follow in his footsteps as regards Huawei, and China saying this groundless move is not out of security concerns. What's behind the British move?
Well, look, we have to admit that there might possibly be security concerns. They haven't been proven. Huawei is, has lots of links to the Chinese government and the People's Liberation Army. So they might well, but it's not proven, have Trojan horses in there, ways to disrupt the networks. But it isn't proven. The US certainly, in the equipment that their companies have been installing, probably has the same thing. There are no angels and no halos on either side here. The competition that comes, Boris Johnson is going to do exactly what Donald Trump tells him. Britain almost always does. It's very rare that a British Prime Minister, ever since Tony Blair, has stood up in any way whatsoever to Washington. And the Brexit deal has made it even more pressing that they do exactly what they're told or else, and they still won't get a good deal. And finally, there's the whole issue of Hong Kong bubbling there. The British are basically completely ineffectual. They do have a legal agreement with Hong Kong, about Hong Kong with the Chinese, which the Chinese have ripped up in a completely illegal way. The Chinese are behaving illegally under the terms of their own treaty. They've broken their own word about this. On a security issue, funnily enough, I mean, the Chinese are asking for the right to go sneaking into everybody's communications wherever they are in the world. So there are grounds to stand up for them. But I rather think that that's not on top of the civil rights for Hong Kongers isn't Boris Johnson's big beef when he's fighting this. He wants to do what America tells him to. He also wants to do what the very big business interests in Hong Kong want, because the moves from the Chinese are very short-sighted, almost as stupid as Trump's trade war. They're very likely to disrupt Hong Kong as a center of commerce in Asia. They're likely to drive companies away from it. They're likely to deprive China of a keyhole into the international system. So on that level, they're all being equally stupid with each other and posturing. The one thing I will take as a certainty is none of them are acting on pure motives, and none of them will they be completely explicit and open about what their motives are, why they're doing these things. In the meantime, there's going to be a lot of posturing. It's going to be like a Japanese sumo match that they're going to grunt and heave and play and grasp each other till one of them gets thrown out the ring. Britain is the junior partner. Britain will be out whichever ring they're in at the moment. They can't win. But Boris Johnson hopes to win an election, so he can live up till then.
Okay. Now, Tony, doesn't the UK's decision concerning the Chinese corporation have something to do with the fact that it's divorcing the EU and just looking to replace it with another market? You also kind of mentioned it in the previous response.
Well, I mean, it makes much more sense for the British to do trade deals with China right now, doesn't it, as we retreat from the European Union? And what Donald Trump and the Americans have managed to do here is to stymie the British. They've said, well, you can either choose China or Britain. Well, what Britain would do, if it had any common sense, was to do deals with both and not to take the same sort of bullying from the United States as they've said they're not prepared to accept from Brussels. But I'd just like to I think, correct Ian. I agree with almost everything he said, but at one point, and that is that the British security services, the arm that is in charge of this kind of cyber security, is GCHQ. It's based just down the road from Gloucester here in Cheltenham. And 6 months ago, they did a thorough check on the Huawei equipment. And they said that they did not believe there was any security risk whatsoever. So this is not me talking. It is the cybersecurity government experts for the UK having a good look at it. And they, I can tell you, know a lot more than I do or anybody else virtually about cybersecurity. They cleared it. And in fact, they even a few years ago had Huawei equipment that was cleared, security safe, to use as internal communications equipment within GCHQ itself, I was told by a former officer of GCHQ, Alex Thompson. So this is an absolute farce. There is no real security risk, certainly no more than there would otherwise be for any equipment. And there are all sorts of questions about backdoors into certain equipment, but certainly nothing more with this Huawei equipment than anything else. What we've got, though, is, as we heard Ian there, a much wider conflict. And this is just one part of that wider conflict. Now, let me tell you, the conflict between Britain and China on trade and America is actually playing out in the streets of Bristol, I've discovered recently, where Hong Kongers who are students, etc., and Hong Kong people living in the city of Bristol in the UK have been going out onto the streets and having very quiet and singing and peaceful demonstrations, very similar actually to some of the nicer things that have been going on in Hong Kong. So just holding up banners, asking people to toot as they go by in their cars. What they've found is that Chinese citizens in Bristol have been taking photographs and boasting that we're now sending these photographs back to China so that you will have trouble for your family because you dare to come out on the streets of Bristol. I even heard today from another family that their relatives have been stopped from getting on an aircraft to come and visit their friends in Britain. Now, this is from China. So they booked tickets and everything to come and visit for a few weeks their relatives who are living in Bristol and in the UK, and they've been told at the airport in China, no, you can't get on the plane because your social credit score is too low. And so they're actually being stopped from visiting their loved ones by the Chinese. So this conflict on Donald Trump seems to be playing out on this international trade level and ramping up towards a real possible shooting war is also playing out here in the streets of Britain.
Okay, Ian, you know that on top of the ban on Huawei components in the U.S., Secretary of State also Pompeo announced visa restrictions for Huawei staffs and employees of other Chinese companies. And Beijing has said it will take necessary measures in response. What could Beijing do?
Well, one of the things that's just been mentioned, I saw on the news, is that the White House is considering restrictions on Chinese Communist Party members coming to the United States. Now, that's a huge cohort, and that includes almost any responsible official or decision maker in China. Whether they find out how they check their party cards, I don't know. Like both of us, I think, are coming out with the message, neither side is clean and innocent here. I mean, I'm personally involved in a close friend of mine is now a hostage in Beijing because the Canadians did what Trump asked them to. And I think totally uncalled for, arrested Ms. Meng, the daughter of the Huawei's owner. They arrested her on an extradition warrant, which shouldn't have applied. They did it without thinking. And then the Chinese, equally unwarrantedly, arrested and are holding as hostage two people in China, and two Canadians. One of them is a friend of mine, Michael Kovrig. And so, you know, there is a lot of skullduggery on both sides. There are no angels here. So I think we should be pointing the finger at all of them. The Canadians shouldn't have arrested Meng. The Chinese shouldn't have taken the hostages. The Chinese shouldn't have ripped up the treaty with Hong Kong. They shouldn't be spying on Chinese nationals here. Trump shouldn't be retaliating in a broad way that affects all Chinese, including innocent Chinese, going about their business. And under it all, there is this thing with Trump, especially, of persistent xenophobia and sinophobia. His worries about China go back, you know, that they go far beyond trade treaties. I mean, there's an element of racism and xenophobia in everything he says or do. You don't go referring to the kung flu for a disease that's there, no matter how much you might criticize government policy.
That's right.
And, you know, it all goes around there. The Chinese made many mistakes, but so far, Donald Trump has made 138,000 dead Americans mistakes with his treatment of the coronavirus. So if we're going to point fingers, there's a lot of finger pointing to be going on. But unfortunately, it doesn't do as much good except it wears out our fingers. There's so many of them that we point fingers at. The one thing to do is to take a detached look and to have a sense of perspective about it and not allow us to be stampeded hysterically by power-hungry politicians, whether they're in Beijing, Washington, or London.
Right. Now, Tony, speaking of retaliation, what sectors in the UK can Beijing target?
Well, one of the things I think they'll almost certainly target is travel for British people. I mean, for example, business people may be involved in the telecoms industry won't be able to travel to China, or they'll find it very difficult to do so. They may be now find it impossible to travel to Hong Kong, where they've had business relationships for a very long time. Another place I think that those restrictions might be imposed is on the Hong Kong Press Club, which I visited when I was in Hong Kong. It's a sort of bastion of free speech in Hong Kong. And actually, they do very good lunches, very subsidised lunches too. But that's the sort of place I think that the Chinese will be clamping down. They'll be maybe trying to make sure that certainly that the people who are running that club are pro-Beijing. You know, that's the sort of thing. The various institutions there are, maybe even the church in Hong Kong, which have Western-oriented people running them. The Chinese will now be looking to flip them out and put their own people in, people who've had an experience in other parts of China, perhaps, or maybe even in Hong Kong under Carrie Lam, imposing some of these restrictions that we've already seen. But look, another little correction to Ian's statement just now. I hope he'll agree with my correction, and that is that Trump has been making almost all the running. If you look at the arrest of Meng Wanzhou from Huawei in Canada in early 2019, late 2018, she's been in jail now for 18 months. But this was very much Trump and the US taking the initiative in trying to ramp up tension. We've seen the same with the expulsion of journalists. You know, this has been basically US doing the expulsions and then China reacting. So you just see this as China doing stuff and America reacting. No, it's the other way around. Are Chinese warships sailing around and around, having little exercises in the Gulf of Mexico or around Manhattan? No, but the US warships are very close to China. So it's the Americans that are making most of the running. And one of the most worrying things about all this is you've got Henry Kissinger like a spider in the middle of the web, sitting in the Waldorf Astoria in New York with his finger in both pies. So he's got very close links to the top of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as into the White House and the US foreign policy, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and other organizations like that. So Kissinger is the one I'd like to see rolled out and get him to explain why it is that the Americans seem to be pushing and pushing to get a war going here.
Now, Ian, given the circumstances, how's this ban on this Chinese telecom giant going to affect the Beijing-London relationship?
Well, it's just going to get worse. I mean, it's very difficult, not least because there isn't a direct commercial interest. And like Tony said, there's a very dubious security interest. It's a real, but far from certain security interest. And the UK is obviously doing just what Trump wants. Just like the Canadians, as I said earlier, no correction was necessary, Tony. It was the Canadians arrested Meng because the Americans told them to. On 24 hours notice, they did it without considering their legal options and the fact that under Canadian law, this should have been referred politically up the tree. It was just treated as an automatic warrant. The Americans ask for someone, you hand them over. It was a shameful episode for Canada. This is a shameful episode for Britain because they haven't made out a case why it's in Britain's interest to do this. There's a sort of penumbra. We're getting back at them for Hong Kong, which is a subtext, but it's not really there because officially the British don't take hostages. But they're making Huawei a bit of a hostage for Hong Kong. But, I mean, it's not going to work. It doesn't work. It's not a rational policy. It's basically, it comes down to acting like a puppet for America. Which we should remember. I mean, the whole Britain's great power status is based on its nuclear weapons, which are basically rented from the Americans. Britain doesn't have an independent nuclear deterrent. It borrows the missiles from the Americans, and the targets are picked by the Americans. So Britain has been incredibly. It's the little Satan and the big Satan, as people have said in the past in your part of the world. So, it's except that, little Satan never gets off the leash anymore. Right. Little Satan does exactly what big Satan tells him to, no more and no less.
Okay, Tony, we have only 1 minute left. I just want to ask you about this Five Eyes alliance, the US, the UK, we have Canada, we have Australia, New Zealand there. US did this ban on Huawei, then asked the UK to do it, pushed it, and the UK did that. Do you think that Canada, Australia, New Zealand will also follow suit?
Well, it's quite possible, but I now talk about the Six Eyes, not the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes is what we're supposed to know about. The Six Eyes includes Israel. And that's, I think, there's a lot of evidence now that the Israeli intelligence services are very, very closely linked to the Five Eyes, possibly in a way that the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders don't know about. So in other words, when they're sharing their intelligence with Britain, that intelligence is then being shared with Israel without their knowledge. But the British media has been almost as bad as the Chinese media on a lot of this. It's totally one-sided. It never criticizes the United States in a way. It loves criticizing Russia and China, but not the US. And we're always criticizing the censorship in China, but we never talk about the BBC censorship. In fact, my own program, and I'd like to put out an appeal here, my own FM program I've been running on the radio for 12 years has just been shut down arbitrarily during the lockdown. And so even voices like mine now are being stifled in Britain, very much like the way that voices have been stifled in China by some of their broadcasters.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. We're out of time, unfortunately. Let me thank our guest, Red investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Gloucester, and senior analyst with Foreign Policy in Focus, Ian Williams, who joined us from New York. Thank you for watching this debate. I've been your host, Behruz Najaf, and I'll see you next time.